Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking about faster global submissions using prior approvals to your advantage. And I'm Gay Esser, the marketing manager here at RegDesk. And if you don't know who RegDesk is or what we do, we are an AI-powered regulatory information management platform with built-in regulatory intelligence. And our intelligent RIM allows RA teams to leverage AI to prepare, manage, and publish international submissions smarter and faster. To focus on you for a minute, again, thank you for coming and joining us for our webinar today. We do a monthly webinar and just love to provide information about regulatory to all the regulatory specialists and VPs and directors and everybody out there. We do appreciate you taking time out of your schedule. We will save the last 5 to 10 minutes of this to go over questions and answers. So feel free while we're going through this to put things in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll address those at the end of the session. And I will send out the presentation and the slide deck and everything later by the end of the week. So be on the lookout for that in your email. And we're going to introduce Jodi now. Jodi is our Director of Regulatory at RegDesk, and she brings over 36 years of experience in quality and regulatory roles within the medical device and IVD industry. She has held leadership roles overseeing global regulatory teams and driving the development and execution of regulatory strategies for all classes of medical devices worldwide. Jodi, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate having you here, and we look forward to what you have to give us today.
Thanks so much, Gay. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate everyone else joining as well. I hope this topic will be helpful and informative to those attending. I'm going to just share my screen. One moment. Sorry, I'm trying to get it to the presentation mode. Give me 1 second. We tested this right before. All right, wonderful. So again, today the topic that we are discussing is how to accelerate global approvals, leveraging prior market authorizations in other jurisdictions. So this is becoming more and more valuable to regulatory teams. So our webinar will move from a structural to a more foundational concept of how to practically implement considerations for reliance pathways. We will begin with an overview of what regulatory reliance is and what the recognition pathways are that are available to manufacturers, including the underlying principles and terminology. Next, we will discuss the key reference markets that are commonly leveraged globally by regulators and explore how those models can differ across jurisdictions. We will then examine the different types of reliance pathways, including recognition, abridged review, and verification models. And finally, we'll talk about some best practices and things that each manufacturer should consider along the way. At the end, as Gay mentioned, we will have an open Q&A session. Feel free to add your questions in the chat, and we will come back to those at the end of the call. So to begin with, what are regulatory reliance pathways? So reliance pathways are really mechanisms that regulators are putting into place to allow each country to simplify the registration process if you have approval in other major markets. So each country will put together mechanisms and allow you to leverage certain approvals. And it is unique to each country what they allow and what they do not. And we'll talk about that a little later in the presentation. It's really important to understand that reliance does not eliminate each individual country's decision-making authority. Just because you have proceeded down a reliance pathway, ultimately it is that country that you're submitting in that has ultimate responsibility to give you approval or not. So it's very important that having prior approval in another market does not guarantee you approval in those countries that have given you a reliance pathway. These reliance models are increasingly being used globally, partially to accelerate patient access to safe and effective medical devices. Regulators are learning, of course, that having manufacturers go through exhaustive review processes for every medical device in every country is very burdensome. And in some cases, if there isn't a good return on investment or a high sales volume that is forecast for a particular market, if those regulatory pathways are burdensome, then some manufacturers will decide not to go into that market. So opening up a reliance model helps manufacturers lessen that regulatory burden, lessen the process, and then the return on investment can look better. So those products that may have been excluded from that particular country will now actually be able to be approved and ultimately utilized on patients. So why does reliance pathways matter? It's becoming increasingly important for several reasons. First of all, there's a growing global demand for faster patient access to innovative medical technologies, particularly in emerging markets where healthcare systems are rapidly evolving. Secondly, regulatory agencies worldwide are facing significant workload pressures and resource constraints. So just like manufacturers have resource constraints, these regulatory agencies are also facing that as well. Many authorities do not have sufficient staffing or specialized expertise in a particular device type to independently review every submission in full detail. This slows down the review process if it is mandated, and it will keep products from coming onto the market in a fast and efficient way. Third, manufacturers are under increasing pressure to reduce approval times and accelerate commercial launch sequencing across multiple markets. So, as you all know, many times manufacturers focus on a couple key markets initially. Many times it is either US approval or European approval, but then as soon as those are in hand, the commercial teams are indicating, well, we want to obviously sell this product globally. We need to get to these other markets. And that work, if it has not begun yet, the timelines can be exhaustive. In addition, the reason the reliance pathways are becoming more and more popular is that there are harmonization going on with international organizations such as the IMDRF and WHO. They've enabled broader acceptance of reliance. So the core principle of reliance is that you can assess the product once and then leverage that approval in many times, so in many different markets. Regulators are using existing evidence generated, whether that be approval certificates, proof that you are approved in one of the major markets, the technical documentation, et cetera. And then they, in many cases, are just doing a cursory review of that information instead of diving into all of the technical safety and efficacy data that is available for the product. In practical terms, this means regulators are using that existing evidence generated for trusted jurisdictions to reduce the amount of work they have to do in their own country. The reliance can apply across multiple areas. So they may rely on the technical documentation reviews. They may rely on quality management system audits. The MDSAP program, as an example, allows one audit to serve as eligibility in multiple markets, all of those that are part of the MDSAP framework. They also are relying potentially on post-market surveillance systems and data that is available. And of course, prior approvals and clearances are leveraged in many reliance pathways. So for manufacturers, this creates substantial opportunities to improve the efficiencies by developing a globally harmonized evidence package that's scalable. So your documentation that you're pulling together, if you look at it from a holistic global point of view, you'll be able to get the information to the regulators in a much more streamlined and effective way. Common forms of regulatory reliance includes looking at the local authority accepting a review decision of another trusted authority with minimal additional review in country. So there are different terminology that are used across the jurisdictions. There are abridged and expedited review pathways that involve just a partial local review of information while leveraging those prior assessments and approvals. The verification review models focus on confirming that the locally submitted device matches an already approved reference market device. So if you're submitting in a country where a reliance pathway is there, they will need evidence of that prior approval in the recognized market. So these collaborative review programs and work sharing kind of initiatives also continue to expand globally, particularly among regulators that are participating in IMDRF or regional harmonization groups. And the intent of that, of course, is to, again, streamline the processes so these medical devices can become available and usable within their own country. Some countries also are starting to rely on third-party conformity assessments. The MDSAP program kind of came out of that. And then we also have some third-party reviews for looking at submissions available as well. So the benefits to the manufacturers is that the reliance pathways allow you to have a reduced time to market. They can lower your regulatory burden and duplication of efforts, and you can have a potential reduction in your submission timeframes. There's more effective global launch sequencing that can occur if you build your strategy out properly, where you know where you're going to be able to utilize these reliance pathways. You can also have improved allocation of regulatory resources and faster patient access to technology. The regulatory authorities also have benefit of utilizing these reliance pathways. They have more efficient use of their reviewer resources. It helps to enhance access to global scientific expertise. They can improve consistency in the regulatory decision making, and there's an ability to focus resources on higher risk products and local public health priorities. Reliance also promotes greater consistency in regulatory decision making, and it allows authorities to focus in, as I mentioned, on those higher risk products, and maybe have an abbreviated process or reliance pathway for those devices that are lower risk. There are important limitations that you should be aware of when you're creating your global regulatory strategy and factoring in the reliance models. Um, the reliance is never equivalent to an automatic approval. Each jurisdiction still maintains country-specific requirements. These are often including local labeling obligations or content. Certainly, language requirements will be factored in. There are authorized representative rules. There will certainly still be registration fees associated with each country. There may be local clinical evidence expectations. There are some countries that require you to demonstrate that your clinical data is representative of the patient population within their jurisdiction. And of course, there are also importation controls that will vary from one jurisdiction to another. So manufacturers must really balance the global harmonization with the country-specific compliance requirements. And the first step, of course, is understanding what each country allows, what their expectations are, and how you can properly map out your regulatory strategy, taking all of that into account. So there's strategic planning that comes up front. Typically when you sit on project teams, especially if you're launching a new product and you intend to go global, creating that global regulatory plan will be not only a design review deliverable, but also critical to the commercial planning. So determining what that reference market that you're going to start with and do your initial submission on is really important from a strategic perspective. The choice of that initial reference market can significantly influence your downstream global expansion opportunities. For example, FDA clearance or EU CE marking can often unlock access to additional reliance pathways globally. That's why a lot of companies focus on FDA and EU clearance initially. Manufacturers should also prioritize global harmonization technical documentation, meaning make sure that when you're pulling together your design requirements, your validation and verification requirements, what standards you're going to be complying with, all of that needs to be factored in with a global worldview. Companies often trip up here where they decide that their reference market is going to be the US and EU, and they only focus in on the requirements in that market and assume that because there are reliance pathways, that they are going to be able to move to these other markets more quickly. But if they have not factored in specific requirements for each of those countries, then they may hit a stumbling block when they submit for a reliance pathway. So regulatory intelligence monitoring is also really essential for reliance pathways. This is changing all the time. It's very dynamic right now with more and more countries coming online with different types of reliance pathways. That regulatory intelligence that's coming, it's not just that they're launching a pathway, but also they are documenting and providing manufacturers a list of what that process will look like, what are the deliverables that are going to be required even when you go down a reliance pathway. And so making sure that you stay in tune with the regulatory intelligence is very important. As many of you know, a design of a product can take a year, 2 years, depending on the complexity of the device that's being developed. And that regulatory strategy may need to change over time. You may have, did a first pass, you've mapped out your reliance pathway plan, and then something is modified by one of these regional regulatory teams that requires you to go back and reassess, does this initial plan make sense? Or do we need to maybe change what our first reference market should be? So the major industry trend is that increasingly reliance pathways are becoming a foundational component of global market access strategy. It's rather than an exception. So more and more countries are coming online, and so this is becoming more and more the norm. Emerging market regulators are adopting reliance models at a growing pace. They're doing this to accelerate patient access while still managing or maintaining oversight. Future trends include greater digitalization of data, data sharing, and then structured interoperability between regulatory systems. Over time, all of this is going to lead to even greater integration of global regulatory requirements and more sophisticated collaborative review mechanisms. So again, the regulatory intelligence that is available from each of these countries must be monitored very closely to ensure that your strategic advantage in understanding what is allowed, what reliance pathways are available to you, can help you build the best regulatory strategy. So, what is a reference market? So, in general, it's typically jurisdictions whose approvals are considered robust enough where another country can rely on the decision. So typically, the regulatory authorities that are selected as reference markets include those that have significant regulatory maturity, meaning their review processes have been shown to be robust and the products that have been approved by that particular country has succeeded in safe and effective medical devices on the market. So they're not having a lot of decisions being made on approval that ultimately turn into significant post-market adverse events. The international reputation of those markets is important. The scientific rigor and process that each of these reference markets have in terms of how they're reviewing the devices, what the inspection capabilities are, and the transparency for the regulatory activities. The most common global reference markets, most of you are likely well aware that the US FDA administration certainly remains one of the most influential reference authorities due to the depth of its scientific review process, especially for those higher risk class devices. FDA also maintains its own inspection capabilities, and there's great transparency in terms of the decision making. When products are approved, it's very easy in a public way to go on their website, understand what has been approved. Summaries of safety and effectiveness are posted, that the manufacturers provide are posted on FDA's website. So it's very easy for other regulators to kind of confirm that that approval exists, and they can check what was approved versus what's being submitted to their own jurisdiction. The EU is also heavily leveraged globally. So although the EU framework differs structurally from FDA review, because it does involve notified bodies operating under MDR and IVDR regulations. Many regulators in other jurisdictions still consider CE marking to represent strong evidence and conformity of safety. It's important to understand, and we'll talk about this in a bit, that when you are leveraging a specific approval or clearance in a reference country to gain approval in another market, that you must retain that approval. So the EU gives its um, own considerations, meaning if you have your product approved in the EU, it is CE marked, and then at some time, perhaps that device, maybe it's not doing well commercially, or certainly when MDD transitioned to MDR, decisions were being made by a lot of manufacturers not to pursue MDR because of the burden of filing those MDR applications, and maybe the products weren't selling well enough to justify and have a return on investment. So if you've gone down a reliance pathway where you have utilized your CE marking and then you later choose to remove the CE marking from the device, that's going to impact the approvals that you have in other markets. So unlike FDA, where your product is approved, um, you're not, even if you take it off the market itself, those approvals still stand. In the EU, that's another matter. If you do not retain that CE marking and continue to go through your surveillance audits for that product, that approval is no longer valid. Therefore, any place that you've leveraged it will be at risk. So it's important to understand that when you are choosing your reference market. Other countries I have listed here are also sometimes utilized as a global reference market. Health Canada, the PMDA, TGA in Australia, and the HSA. So it's important when you're developing these strategies to understand what global reference markets are accepted in each country. It is different in each jurisdiction, what they allow, and then you can choose appropriately which one should be your reference for that market. Again, the reason why these particular markets are frequently referenced is really due to the maturity of the regulatory system and the highly established review methodologies. So their processes are typically well documented, highly structured, scientifically rigorous. Second, these markets typically have strong post-market surveillance infrastructures. Regulators globally place confidence not only in pre-market assessments, but also in the ability of these systems to detect and respond to post-market safety signals. So if complaints are being filed, adverse events are being filed, then the data associated with those is going to be readily available, and these reference market regulators are going to be taking action. So that's really an important piece of the puzzle and why reference markets are selected. Third, these regulators generally maintain robust inspection and quality oversight programs. So as an example, FDA inspections or MDSAP participation significantly strengthen global confidence in manufacturing oversight. EU CE marking, people are being audited on a routine basis every year to ISO 13485. So because of all of these robust quality management system inspection and oversight programs, the trust has built over time for other countries to want to recognize the work that they're doing. The last is really, again, looking at international convergence organizations such as IMDRF or MDSAT. Participation by a particular country in these initiatives demonstrate alignment with globally accepted best practices. So having countries participate in these, again, helps to build that trust and reliance. The reliance to different countries is not uniform. So every single regulatory entity who wants to implement a reliance pathway will define what that pathway looks like. Every authority will have its own criteria regarding which reference markets it accepts, what products qualify, because sometimes they will have a reliance pathway, but only for certain devices or certain classifications. And they will also define how much additional review they are going to perform locally on top of the evidence you give them that a reference market has given you approval. So all of these details are important to understand so that you can map those global regulatory plans out effectively. In addition, there may be local testing or clinical data that are necessary as well. So even if there's a reliance pathway, you still have to understand it's beyond just giving them an approval certificate in most cases. It's going to be a level of additional documentation that's very specific to that local jurisdiction. And that local jurisdiction ultimately has the ability to issue your approval or not. Reliance eligibility may vary by device risk classification, if it's a novel technology, whether the product is sterile or not, if it is an implant, if they're software. Some software devices are excluded from reliance pathways. So these are all of the details that you need to be looking at in terms of your regulatory intelligence to ensure that you can map out a valid plan. One of the biggest issues, I think, where I've seen clients, manufacturers falter with trying to utilize reliance pathways is not understanding the individual details within each jurisdiction. They think, oh, they accept FDA approval, so as long as I have that, I don't need to worry about anything else. And that is rarely the case. It is much more, there's much more detail that goes involved in countries giving you reliance pathways. And so you really need to dig into the details to be successful. This slide focuses on one of the most important practical considerations for industry, and that is how to really develop your global launch sequencing strategy. In order for manufacturers to determine that, you really have to decide in what order you're going to pursue approvals and mapping out that timing, understanding where reliance pathways are going to be used and where they're not is important, so that you can build your plan, and then commercial is understanding when the products would be available to them in their specific markets. So as I've mentioned before, many manufacturers really focus in on FDA clearance or EU CE marking because you do get a lot of bang for your buck in terms of being able to leverage those approvals in other markets. Also, many times the US and EU, from a commercial standpoint, have the biggest sales. So it makes sense to start there. But if you have not anchored your plan to also consider the additional information that's needed in the other jurisdiction, those approvals are only going to get you a fraction of the way there. So you really need to look at, for any given product, the commercial priorities, reimbursement opportunities, manufacturing readiness, your post-market obligations, and where you are in terms of getting things set up for that device from a post-market point of view, and then determining how you're going to launch. What your launch order is going to be, not only from a commercial perspective, but when you expect those approvals to come in. Another key factor here is really looking at documentation harmonization. So historically, manufacturers many times looked at each submission as a separate task. And each of those submissions was kind of handled sometimes in a silo by different teams. You might have regional partners that are doing it. And if you continue to look at each of these submissions as separate entities and not linked, you're going to lose that strategic advantage that you have for these reliance pathways. You need to make sure that the documentation is really harmonized across global requirements. The more aligned your technical documentation is structured from a global perspective, the easier it will be to leverage that information and gain approvals across multiple jurisdictions in an easier way. Life cycle management also must be considered. As I mentioned before, changes in your approvals in one jurisdiction may trigger cascading problems elsewhere. So if you are planning to take a product off the European market and you've utilized that reference approval for many other jurisdictions, you have to factor that in to your lifecycle management. And you may need to, even if you're not actively selling that particular product in the EU, there may be other reasons why you want to maintain the approval. There are different regulatory reliance pathways that are available. As I mentioned, it's going to vary from country to country. So the recognition pathways often involved the local authority largely accepting the regulatory decision of the reference market. So these are typically the fastest pathways for approval. So if you have approval in the market, you can provide that evidence. They may have very limited additional review in country. So that's the quickest pathway available in certain places. The second is abridged review pathways. So this is where you're going to give that evidence of prior approval, but there may also be certain documentation that the local authority still wants to dive into the details. Maybe they want to look at your risk management, in more detail, or your clinical data in more detail. So that will be you'll be well aware of what different sections they are going to do a deeper dive based on the regulatory documentation that they've issued for these pathways. The second is like a verification review pathway. This is where the primary focus is confirming that the locally submitted product matches what's already approved for a reference market device. So this regulators verify consistency rather than repeating a full scientific assessment. So each of these models, and there's more out there as well, but each of these models will vary in terms of the documentation burden, the review timelines, the local data requirements, the deliverables they expect you to submit. And so manufacturers need to understand not only if a reliance pathway exists, but which pathways and what the expectations are for each. There are several operational dimensions that distinguish reliance models from one another. So the first is a degree of independent review. So recognition pathways generally involve minimal local review, while abridged pathways involve some kind of partial review. They're going to dig deeper in certain areas. And then full review pathways require, of course, extensive independent assessment. So where they're not leveraging any kind of review or approval in another market. The second dimension for these models is really speed to market. As I mentioned, recognition pathways are usually the fastest because they rely heavily on prior approvals. And then different hybrid or abridged pathways are kind of moderate in terms of duration, while full independent reviews are generally the longest in terms of how long it takes to get your approval. Your submission complexity will also vary. So the verification and recognition models typically require reduced documentation packages, whereas the more substantial country-specific full reviews certainly will require more information to be submitted. As I mentioned before, the applicability also varies based on device risk. Some pathways are available for certain classifications. Sometimes there's no reliance pathways for higher risk devices or specific types of devices. And so it's important for you to understand what your device classification is, what your indications are, if it has software, if it is an implantable, because that may alter the pathways available to you. So in terms of strategic considerations for manufacturers, one of the most important best practices is integrating regulatory strategy early into the product development rather than waiting and treating this as a downstream activity. Global evidence generation planning should occur proactively. You need to know what the global requirements are, not just the requirements for those key reference markets you're going to start with. You need to understand if there are different requirements for clinical data or performance data, if there's cybersecurity or usability differences from one market to another, your post-market surveillance requirements. All of that is important to understand and factor in very early in your development process. Your document scalability is also equally important. If you build your plan properly and you ensure that the data you're generating for the first market you intend to go in will also comply with the requirements for the remaining markets, then that being able to utilize that documentation will be seamless. And that will save you time, effort, and money in the long run. Organizations should also ensure that they have strong regulatory intelligence processes. As I've mentioned before, the use of reliance pathways is changing so rapidly at this time. I think a lot of markets understood that they were being left out in terms of being in scope for particular manufacturers to launch their products because it was just too difficult. It took too long. The amount of documentation that had to be submitted was high, and maybe the sales were not going to compare to other markets like the US and the EU. So by them putting these reliance pathways in place, it allows them to get technology for their citizens and for doctors to be able to utilize products that have been shown to be safe and effective. So it's really important that you're building your global strategy at the beginning and that you are factoring in the individual country requirements, even though you're going to start maybe with the US or the EU first. The next few slides, I'm not going to go into great detail, but I wanted to include them because this is part of what regulatory intelligence can provide to you. So this happens to just be an overview, and you'll see I put several slides in here of different markets of whether or not reliance pathways are available. And if so, what are some of the details behind those reliance pathways? One thing I've also included is if a FSC, a free sale certificate, or a CFG, certificate of foreign goods, is required. The reason I include that is sometimes folks confuse reliance pathways with needing an FSC or a CFG. They're completely separate entities. So an FSC or CFG being mandatory is whatever country the product is being manufactured in, you need to have one of these certificates to show it is approved in that country of origin. So there may not be a reliance pathway in certain markets, but they'd still require a free sale certificate. So if you're a US company, you are going to have to get your US approval in order to get a CFG. So I've included that because I've had a number of clients get confused thinking, in their minds that that's some part of some reliance pathway, but in fact, it's actually just a separate deliverable requirement of having approval in the country of origin. So these charts will provide you, a very high level understanding of where reliance pathways are available in a number of markets. This is not holistic of every global market, but it just shows you the variety and the varied pathways that do exist and why a regulatory monitoring and regulation monitoring is so dynamic, and you have to stay up to speed because anything can change in any of these markets at a given time. And understanding when those changes are made could allow you to get your products on the market sooner. So I'll just skip through these real quick. So the key takeaways are really that regulatory reliance pathways are becoming more foundational. It's becoming more and more accepted in different markets. Different countries are adopting them. Reliance does not eliminate the local regulatory authority. Even if you have approval in a reference country, ultimately it's that other jurisdiction that's providing a reliance pathway. It's still their decision to make whether or not they're going to grant approval to you or not. And it's still their decision to make whether or not they want to ask for additional documentation. Successful reliance strategies really depend heavily on selecting the right initial reference market. And in order to do that, it is not just, well, we want to go to US first from a commercial point of view. It is looking at the individual requirements across the globe, all of the countries where you want to market your product, and determining which approval is going to give you the most leverage the most quickly. And reliance models, as I mentioned, differ significantly across jurisdictions. The eligibility is influenced by your device class, implantability, sterility, etc., as I mentioned before. So understanding those nuances in the legislation is really important. You want to make sure that your documentation is harmonized and scalable so that you're not starting from scratch every time you're trying to pull the documentation together for a given market. That regulatory intelligence monitoring is critical because these frameworks change, the eligibility criteria changes, and the operational expectations change over time. Mapping out your plan so you understand the sequencing will be critical, especially to your commercial team, because they need be aware if you are leveraging one particular reference country for another market, that you need to get that approval before the clock can start ticking in that secondary market. And ultimately, these reliance pathways, I think industry should be excited about it because it does help you speed the regulatory review process in a given market and get these products available to patients. That's really the key takeaway. Ultimately, manufacturers really need to build scalable, global, harmonized strategies today. Those that kind of fail when they're trying to go global are those that did not look at the big picture when they were creating their plans and their strategies. They focused in on one or two key markets and they missed the boat in terms of requirements that they would need for other places. So make sure you're not just thinking globally, or thinking locally in the short term. You need to think globally in the long term. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and we'll move on to Q&A.
Perfect. Thanks for all the information, Jodi. I know that probably clarified a lot of things for people. We do have a couple questions, and you might have covered some of them obviously later on, so you can let me know if you've already covered them, you think to the best of what they need answered. So the first question, does the FDA accept leveraging of submissions from Japan?
They do not.
Okay. And then this goes into Japan a little more. How does one leverage documents and submissions from Japan or other reliance countries for US market, in particular for a PMA?
Well, I think what you have to do is look at the requirements for that particular device in Japan versus what FDA is going to expect. You'll need to do a gap assessment of that. It's going to be product specific, of course. So there's no kind of cheat sheet of Japan to FDA. You've really got to look at the requirements in each market and do that full gap assessment.
Okay. How do you address device classification differences between different geographies? For example, what does class two be like if it's class two in one geography and can be a class three in another one? How do you address those differences?
Yeah, from a reliance perspective, it'll be clear in the legislation what products are eligible for reliance pathways. And just because a product has a different classification in the US, as an example, than maybe it does in a country that accepts US approval, doesn't mean that you can't utilize that pathway. So it's just important to dive into the details. Classification differences, you need to be aware of them. You need to understand from a reliance pathway perspective if it rules you out in a given market, and what the individual requirements are in each, both your reference and your target market, so that you're prepared. Yeah.
Okay. Do you know why NMPA/China is not used as a reliance market? Based on their regulations, YY standards and local testing, it is one of the most stringent regulatory markets, and they're surprised they're not included as is the FDA CE mark Health Canada HSA.
I'm just I don't know for sure, but my guess would be is that the transparency of information is likely the gating item there. So information about that review process, post-market approvals, et cetera, is not as readily available as it is in other reference countries. And so I think that's probably why they're a lot of other countries kind of haven't jumped on China approvals in order to leverage them.
Okay, that makes sense. And another one, how do you address gaps in the reference dossier when with the relying authority requires data elements, for example, local clinical evidence, post-market surveillance plans that weren't mandated by the reference agency?
You have to plan ahead for that. Need to understand what those gaps are at the beginning of the process so you can plan for them and close them. If they're required in the target market, you're not going to be able to get around it just because that reference market didn't require it. So that's why creating that strategy up front, understanding what the local additional requirements are going to be on top of just having your letter of approval or clearance letter is absolutely critical in your planning process.
Okay, and we have a few more. So how should manufacturers determine the optimal first approval market when they're building a reliance-based global strategy?
As I had mentioned in the presentation, you really have to look at it holistically. You need to look at your commercial plans, like what countries do you intend to sell the most? And sometimes that is the US or EU, so those are done first. But you also need to look at strategically where you want to move from there. So I think that reference market, you may choose it for different reasons depending on the project that you're on.
Okay. Can significant post-market changes invalidate reliance eligibility in downstream markets?
Yes, it can. So sometimes post-market changes are do require issues. So, as an example, during the presentation, I mentioned that if you post-market, you decide to remove your product from Europe and you're no longer going to CE market, but you have utilized that European approval to leverage in other places, that's going to impact you. You're going to have to create a strategy and work with the regulatory authorities to kind of change your reference market for that particular approval.
Okay, a couple more. Are reliance pathways equally effective for software as a medical device?
In general, no. So at this point in time, some markets exclude a software as a medical device for reliance pathways. And I think part of that is just it's a newer area and they haven't quite built that trust up. There may also be cybersecurity, AI or machine learning evolution requirements, other things that they feel they still need to do more of a deeper dive. So you have to look at your target market and understand what they will accept for a software as a medical device versus a standard medical device.
Okay, and I think we can have time for one more and I'll wrap everything up. What are the biggest operational mistakes companies make when trying to leverage reliance pathways?
I think the biggest thing I've seen is just not looking holistically at the plan. And I think so many manufacturers focus on US or EU first, and then immediately they want to go global, but they haven't factored in the requirements for those other markets. That's the biggest area I see delaying the process. I'll give one example that's really easy. So in the US, electronic IFU is accepted and English is accepted. You're going to submit in the US first. So they do all of the, your packaging validation, your sterility validation, et cetera, assuming this product's going to have no paper IFU in the box and it's going to be this size. Now, when you're trying to go global, you may need a paper IFU in the box. And if you haven't designed your box big enough to fit that paper, or you haven't done your studies for shipping and sterilization to factor in paper in the box of a particular size, you've got to start over again. So that's just one example of an area that I've seen manufacturers really kind of miss the boat, just focusing on a reference market first. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that example. That definitely helps to wrap it up and make you understand it a little bit better. So that's all the questions we have. And again, thank you so much for coming today and sharing all this great information. I know everybody will find it super informative. For everybody attending today, we will send out the slide deck and presentation by the end of the week. And if you have any follow-up questions, be sure to reach out and check out RegDesk. I put the website in the chat, so you have that information there. And if you have any questions for us, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks again, everybody, and thank you so much, Jodi.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.